Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. This is afternoon here in Cambridge in the UK. Thank you for joining me. This is Redgate's webinar on data catalogs, the key to SQL Server compliance. And I'm going to be talking for an hour or a little under on some of the ways that we see data catalogs emerging to meet changing compliance needs, changing regulatory needs, and the changing need to address the data breach epidemic. So first of all, I'll introduce myself. I'm the only presenter today. My name is Richard McCaskill. I'm a product manager for Redgate Software. So I joined Redgate a few years ago. Prior to that, I'd spent 20 years as a database developer and IT manager. Jumping from Oracle to SQL Server in the year 2000, following the year 2000 project. And I've worked in financial systems, BI, line of business systems, risk and performance. Largely in London financial services companies, and following a long stint as a IT manager at a hedge fund where I had some exposure to regulatory change and information governance. I became a product manager at Redgate, just as good a jump as my jump from Oracle to SQL Server, and following which I've worked on SQL Clone, Data Masker, and I now work as a product manager in our data privacy and protection initiative. And still, after several years, I'm boring everybody that I come across at Redgate and elsewhere with compliance stories and stories about how DevOps relates to compliance. And it's a big theme for us here at Redgate. So I'm going to come into some of the initiatives that are going on, a little update on some of our early access work on a data catalog. Now, first of all, let me just say this is not going to be one of those presentations where I spend an hour talking about recital 32 of the general data protection regulation. I will talk a little about regulatory concerns and how we are seeing them impact what people are doing, how database administrators and data professionals are working with their colleagues and sometimes working with new colleagues or in slightly different cross-functional initiatives. But there have been, I suppose, 6 months ago, a year ago, I'm guilty of it myself. We spent a lot of time sort of explaining what the general data protection regulation was, explaining how things are changing. And I think that message is quite well understood. So I won't be going into detail on specific regulations, not great detail anyway. What we're going to do instead in this hour is to talk about what's happening in terms of the change that we're seeing in the behaviours of data professionals caused by these regulatory changes and caused by the data breach epidemic. Specifically, I'm going to talk about how you go about the task of classifying your data, why it's recognised as possibly the correct approach to dealing with some of these new challenges, and what options are available to a SQL Server data professional to address some of these challenges. We'll weigh a few different approaches up against each other. I've got a couple of demos to run through. And finally, we're going to talk about the early access program that we're running for our data catalog capability. I'm going to give you a preview of where that's up to and invite your interest in helping us to understand what we really need to do to solve classification for the SQL Server data professional. So a little bit of background, first of all. Data privacy is a priority. There are no surprises there. Nobody's going to fall off their chair at this slide. But it's confirmed throughout our surveys, our market data. We engaged a firm to survey 400 IT professionals, not Redgate customers. We didn't want to just be listening to our own echo chamber necessarily. We asked the firm to go and seek out some medium to large size organizations, and they came back with this: the data privacy and protection is a priority for IT leaders in 73.8% of organizations of those almost 400 that we surveyed. I believe we're going to publish this survey at some point, but it is a very clear focus and a very clear priority at all levels of organizations. It is the key focus for a very large number. And this is how we see it playing out? We've been speaking to people on some sort of governance path, some sort of recognizing a need to get a better handle, get a better way of communicating with the business, get a better level of certainty, a better way of expressing the policy choices that are made around handling data for a couple of years now. And we see a wave of adoption that'll be familiar to many of you as a common way of understanding how industry practices form and become part of the majority behavior. We were speaking to people in 2017 going into 2018, in some cases had already addressed governance concerns, had already aligned the risk appetites, the risk assessment approach to data privacy and protection pretty thoroughly. They were generally highly regulated industries, and we would call them the innovators, but they were a very small minority. There are not many organizations where the data function and the business risk functions and the compliance functions feel that they're truly aligned, that they've done the work that they need to do, that it's just business as usual. The most of us, the vast majority, are on some sort of a trajectory of change. This year we've been speaking to what we might call the proactive DBAs, or the ones that have been able to get buy-in from their organizations to invest time and effort in understanding and describing and bringing control onto their data operations. We think this is going to continue to grow. We're seeing strong signs among our customers of growth, and I'll talk a little about some of the customers and engagements that we're working with at the moment, and the data, the experience that they're going through. We think the GDPR has been the driving force for many of these people behind the current wave, and now we're starting to see the emergence of these categories under US regulations as well. Of course, CACPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, and SHIELD in New York state legislation. We've got quite a few others at state level coming in as well in the US. And of course, what we haven't shown here, but there's also been adoption in Japan and Australia of legislation very much aligned with GDPR and the particular risk assessment approach that it's taken. So I said I wouldn't plow through GDPR articles and recitals, but I will just briefly mention, for a bit of context, some of the absolute requirements of the law. And these are requirements that are typical of these new wave of regulations. I'm sure you're largely familiar with these. But the information that you collect and process now has to be documented. You have to be capable of describing what you do with information that you gather and the purpose for which you gather it. Processing, we should note, always includes storage. It's not just in this data manipulation sense of processing. Consent management is a particular difficulty, and we need to manage consent. That tends to be something that's there've been some attempts at bringing solutions to the market, the web add-ins and such like, but that's something that we need to concern ourselves with, and we need to know which processing activities are under our responsibility. So the requirement to gather that key information, to maintain it, uphold it, and to make it accessible is very clear from the legislation. The language, as I say, in other regulations is very similar and similarly clear. So this has led an awful lot of people to conclude that a data catalog of some sort, a data dictionary, database metadata, is going to be a key part of the response to this regulatory and business risk change. So for many people, that straight away they'll go to the data catalog. A data catalog being information about information, semantic context. Gartner has a couple of definitions. It's the inventory of data assets maintained through the discovery, description, and organization. And that very much means, we think, classification, adding metadata, adding tags to the information that you hold. And they exist for a variety of reasons. We've seen several waves of the data catalog, of course. It's not a new concept by any means. I mentioned that I used to work in the Lloyd's of London insurance market in London, where we had a data dictionary in the IT department. This was physically a data dictionary, which might strike some as slightly archaic and quaint. It was literally a large black-bound volume which described every piece of data and every table that the organisation held, what it was held for, and the technical aspects of its treatment. That was there largely for purposes of understanding a complex data estate. And we see data catalogues have arisen over the years for multiple reasons. Key among them have been reasons of complexity, organizational complexity following mergers and acquisitions, chaos due to poor governance or low levels of organization historically. We see technical complexity in recent years has driven a movement towards data catalogues to handle proliferation, to deal with some of the shortcomings of understanding the contents of data lakes and schemaless data stores, and to align understandings across multiple relational database management systems. Sometimes it's about it delivers business benefit in terms of data quality, in terms of the ability to deliver data inside an organization, in the ability to derive secondary value for data. There are multiple reasons. The ones that we think need addressing among the people we're speaking to at Redgate for when we're working on a data catalog, they are care very much about the regulation and then the correct treatment of data. So there's a set of needs which are focused around data privacy, being able to tell a story about data, tell a story about the treatment of data in your organization. So what kind of information is held in a data catalog? It varies, of course, but there's a lot of commonality. The classification which aligns with a regulatory need or a business understanding of what the data is, that allows understanding of what policy might be appropriate is very much key. And we see these other needs of description, easing the burden of communicating from the tech to business and between technical members of the technical team. So why this current spur of interest in data catalogs, of course, is about GDPR, the California Consumer Privacy Act, the data breach epidemic, and we hear from analysts that there's a great deal of curiosity and interest in and desire to get some guidance on what to do around this data catalog problem. But one of the things that I think is interesting is in particular about this wave of the data catalog is that it is cross-functional. The reason it's cross-functional is because the data professional is now being asked to illustrate, to demonstrate, to show the risk functions of an organization, how they're treating data and that they are treating data in alignment with regulation. And it's not just a simple box ticking exercise, have you done it or have you not? It's an ongoing need. The responsibility for compliance, certainly to the GDPR, explicitly exists at board level. The legislation was written very, very carefully to avoid this dereliction of duty, whereby responsibility was passed from pillar to post and never entirely clear in organizations, and also across organizations, of course. Companies were trying to outsource the risk inherent in managing data. Well, that's been addressed pretty robustly, with statutory responsibility being described and penalties which have been designed to be effective and dissuasive. So your colleagues can't just trust you anymore. It's not personal. They might respect your capabilities wonderfully, but they now have a job to do which involves having oversight of the data function. What's more, the requirements are very explicitly not to be in somebody's head. I think this is almost a comical piece of advice from the UK regulator, the Information Commissioner's Office. The records you keep must be in writing. They're clearly addressing a problem that has existed of tribal knowledge and expertise of a few key individuals. being foisted upon the regulator as some kind of a substitute for managed treatment and policy. So you will have to go beyond telling somebody that you've got it in control, that you understand the systems, that you could draw a database schema on the back of a napkin in the bar. It's not that your knowledge is being tested. Your ability to demonstrate to your colleagues, potentially to regulators, to due diligence committees, and to people looking for assurance because they've got a supply chain relationship with you. You will have to repeatedly show that you're doing the right thing and that you know where your data assets are and how they're being handled. And peer scrutiny is, once it's out of the bag, I believe is permanent and will be permanent. So the tech to business conversations didn't conclude around GDPR go live date of 25th May by any means. And I think I see some parallels with the regulatory change that took place in the investment management organizations following the Lehman collapse, which of course was just we recently not celebrated but observed the 10th anniversary of that period, and that was quite swiftly followed in the UK anyway by reform of regulation, by such measures as compulsory compliance officers in investment management firms, who were empowered and required to describe a clear picture of the compliance activities and the ongoing scrutiny of all the organization's functions, of all an investment management firm's functions. So where once an IT manager, a sysadmin would be held responsible, certainly for a system being available, the ways in which it was made available, or the ways in which resilience was built in, was really just a technical question. It was an outcome-based assessment of the activities of the IT function. That changed very quickly. The organisation I was in certainly saw that change very quickly, and it became a situation where the scrutiny was continuous, and the people responsible for oversight very quickly became relative experts in technical areas where previously they'd have very little knowledge. So there was a gain of knowledge and a change in the way that people worked on both sides, on the technology side and on the scrutiny side. Measures in the GDPR, like data protection impact assessments, are designed clearly to maintain that engagement, to require the ongoing oversight and the ongoing transparency around data controls. The ability to respond to subject access requests is not something that's just measured by failure if you're unable to respond. Not being able to respond to these statutory rights that data subjects now have is in itself a punishable situation. It doesn't have to all go wrong before it will all go wrong for your organization, in short. And what that's led to, as we've seen with the people that we're working with on data classification, is that the DBA who in Redgate's database DevOps work spends a lot of time with the CTO, the IT manager, and the dev team, is spending more and more time with the data privacy and protection group. They're getting to know the InfoSec team. They're getting to know data protection officers and chief data officers much more than they ever have before, and they're being assigned tasks, assigned projects specific to those requirements, and not as part of the sort of long wish list of things that we would all like to do one day. We're seeing fundamentally, we're seeing DBAs change the function. I say DBA, I mean all the people that perform those stakeholder key sort of stakeholder for the relational databases. We're seeing them perform new kinds of projects and work in new kinds of ad hoc teams and with new reporting lines. Why is that? Of course, it's because we know that it's not all about the hacker. The penny is finally dropping. That the cartoon image of the nefarious hacker with the hoodie in a bedroom that gets wheeled out in the press reports really doesn't describe what is going on. Surveys continuously show us, consistently show us that malicious attack is only a part of the story. It's generally seen to be about half of the picture. It's generally seen to be human error and systems error that accounts for a very large number of data losses. You may have seen in the Veeam lost a lot of data through a misconfiguration of a database online, and this is typical. It's almost unfair to pick any particular organisation out. It's affecting the industry as a whole, and the regulators are serious about us taking it seriously. So they come up with stipulations such as, and again, this is from the GDPR, but very, very similar language in other regulation. Each controller shall maintain a record of processing activities, remembering that processing includes storage under its responsibility. We're now required to show where it is and what it is, all the data, wherever it's held, what type of data it is, and how it's being protected. We don't have a lot of capability in the relational database engines. We're seeing some change in that, of course, and I'll speak to that in a moment. But we do feel that we need to gather the information somewhere else so that we can describe it without being completely dependent on the inbuilt engine capabilities. It's not enough to have a field name that's vaguely descriptive. It doesn't really tell us what it's being used for, and whether our treatment of it should comply with regulations. Likewise, the description field, free text, is unlikely to give us great faith in the ability to, for example, automate policy or even describe accurately. We need to say where it is, what it is, and how it is being protected. And that's at the heart of the data classification need. So let's move on to some of the options that are available for database administrators on SQL Server. The first instinct of many organizations and of many information governance exercises over the years has been to just use the tools at our disposal. So what can we do to understand the SQL Server schema, to understand what we're holding and how it all works with each other, where the dependencies are? We've got some abilities to inspect the schema, of course. We've got catalog views, information schema views, dynamic management views. So I thought I'd take a slightly naive approach, but one, to be honest, I had taken before in a previous role in an information governance exercise, and just think, how hard can it be? Let's go and just grab the information schema, drop it into Excel, and see how we go. So this is a slightly artificial, but let's just have a look at what that looks like when we go into SQL Server Management Studio. So so here I've what I did first of all. Actually, my first step was to go to Simple Talk. It's a great trusted source for excellent articles on how to get the most out of your time, how to perform operations using SQL Server. And I found an article by Rob Sheldon from a couple of years ago, which described just basically how to join together some columns in some of the information schema tables. So I just came up with this query. This looks like it's going to do the right thing for me. I'm just joining up sys columns, sys types, and sys tables. I want to get a few attributes out, and I'm just going to run this against the AdventureWorks database. So that's all very well. I've got some output there. If I zoom in a little, I've got the basic information that I think I need from the AdventureWorks database in order to start looking at those column names and try to perform some classification. So let's. I've got SQL prompts installed. You've always got to give it a nudge, give it a little push. So I'm going to select that all, and right click and open it in Excel. That's all very well and good. I can see my data in Excel. I'll probably want to tidy up. Here's one I was playing with earlier, and I'm going to start categorizing it. So this is fine. I'm doing the job that's required of me. It won't take too long. Hopefully I'll be done. I can do this on a Friday afternoon. I can send this over to the InfoSec team, and we'll see if we can just move on to some more interesting work after that. But there's a few problems with this, of course. I've got free text entry here. Okay, I could take care of that. I've got a lack of clarity about whether these columns are actually in use. But fundamentally, I've got a fire and forget approach. It's going to take a lot of effort, a lot of process change to make sure that somebody comes in here and keeps it up to date every time there is a schema change. I might have a problem with volume. 494 columns, okay, that looks possibly something that I could deal with. This is the AdventureWorks database. Let's remember, it is not typical. I ran this against a sample customer schema that I'd been provided with. I got 40,000. One of our customers on the early access program for our data catalog classification product, which I'll show you shortly, has 120,000 columns. And there's a cost, of course. In fact, working through these without any kind of systematic approach, just purely attacking it with bulk. One of our customers had hired in a junior member of the IT team and asked them to clock the hours and the progress, and they managed to clock up 200 hours of classification effort before they were asked to stop. You can pick the wage rate of a junior employee in the IT firm and multiply that by 200 hours. They were, after 200 hours, they had actually made fairly impressive progress. They managed to classify 40,000 columns, so 200 hours, 40,000 columns, but they were nowhere near really breaking the back of it. They still had a lot of questions to ask of other members of the organization, and they just felt that this wouldn't fly. Not only was it going to be stale and forgotten, it was costing too much, and the results were likely to be insufficient. So that's no great surprise. Slightly artificial, as I say, to look at the very manual approach, but it is one of those problems we think that's harder than might initially seem. We think we need to break down classification into manageable chunks. We need to apply some intelligence to it. We need to make this such an achievable and effort that is worthwhile in the long term and has and pays clear dividends. So the Excel and the SQL Server information schema, we think, is probably not going to cut the mustard for very many organizations. It's a fire and forget exercise. We don't expect our environments to stay the same, servers to keep the same. We don't expect there to be no refactoring of database schemas. We'd be a slightly unusual organization if we didn't perform any changes, and certainly if we didn't respond to challenges that we might come across. And of course, if we don't have confidence in it, if we think that it might be out of date, then we'll ignore it, and we start to incur those costs of it's a very famous quote from a good while ago, but those costs of understanding products, understanding systems without the ability to reference some sort of metadata or organizational documentation incurs serious costs. So we're not the only people who've thought that this approach is going to fall short and be unlikely to meet the ongoing needs of organizations. So Microsoft have also introduced some classification capability. We'll take a quick look at where they're up to so far. I'll just log into this other machine. In the Microsoft capability, excuse me 1 second, I just need to switch to the right virtual machine there. So if we look in SQL Server Management Studio, we do also have a less naive approach available to us. So let's not knock the setup paper tigers there. There are some things that we can work with here. So if I go to SQL Server Management Studio from, I think it was 17.4 onwards, I do have this classify data capability. And if I go into that, I suspect many of you will be familiar with this this interface. It gives me the ability to add classifications to my schema. In SQL Server on-premise, we currently only have the ability to write these into extended properties. But in Azure SQL database, we know that these are now stored as attributes. So this is a permanent change that's coming to the SQL Server engine. It's already there in Azure and coming to the on-premise version of the SQL Server engine in the next version. And this gives us something to work with. So we've been talking to a lot of organizations about who've tried this approach, and there are some shortcomings. First of all, the information types and sensitivity labels are static. We know Microsoft are on a path of improvement for this, so I don't want to be unfair about this at all, but there are some shortcomings that we think might continue to exist for a little while. So these values are supplied for us as a sort of sample set of policy at present. These are just early days. We think that's likely to change. They're likely to improve the approach that you can take in SSMS. But it's still fundamentally a database by database exercise. We have recommendations that are based on the column names. We have the ability to remove them. But there are some very specific problems that we think we need to address for organizations to really tackle the data classification problem. And I'm going to come on to these. So some of the challenges that exist are that we possibly need to roll up and possibly get visibility of what's inside one of these database containers. So if we're looking at an instance at present, now I know the story is developing on the threat assessment side of Azure SQL DB, but we've got lots of questions that we haven't yet answered. So do you label the thing or the container of the thing? These are challenges that have faced people applying labels and building catalogs for many years. At what level do you supply a label? Is it always the column level, or should it sometimes be a table, for example? Should it sometimes be a schema? Should you also have roll-up visibility into another container like a database instance? And we want to try and explore some of these needs as we build out our data catalog. We also want to potentially go beyond those capabilities of just holding it against the information, holding it against the schema itself, because we know that there's problems with things like orphaned items. What if I labeled something as critical and it then that column then disappeared in a refactoring? What am I to do? So we're trying to address on our early access program some of those additional needs and challenges. We've also got some specific issues. How do I know that I've got everything? How can I get assurance about completeness? Have I looked everywhere? What about my dev and test instances? We know, for example, that the prevalence of organizations using copies of production data has not dropped in recent years. It may even have gone up. We're seeing consistently between 70 and 80% of organizations tell us that they have copies of production data outside production, where it's likely to have fewer security controls or less compliance with policy. It certainly is very likely to have a larger attack surface area. How do I deal with new instances coming online and new systems being delivered? So baking manual processes or semi-manual processes into your software development lifecycle is going to be pretty challenging, we think. There's a particular problem with third-party databases as well. I think that the existing catalogs have often taken a sort of production-only view of the world. In the case of some of those previous points, but they've also taken a view which excludes the schemas which are supplied by vendors. And in fact, it's very common for organizations, as most of you will know, I suspect a great many will have experience of, that the vendor database, the vendor schema, is very much involved in the processes. Many vendor schemas allow extensions to be provided by customers, and regardless of whether you've customized the third-party database or not, if you're running that database, you're responsible for it. You're a controller in the terms of the General Data Protection Regulation. When you do make changes to a vendor schema, you're generally having to do it within a defined set of parameters. Very often, updates will disregard extended properties, for example, if that's the place that you're storing the metadata, the information about what the column is. Do you know that your next vendor update won't remove the classifications that you've supplied? And moreover, do you know that your support contract will allow you to make classifications changes to that schema? And then, of course, we've got all problems of maintenance over time and delivering metadata information that's likely to stay alive, or at least let you know that it's going to require attention. So we'd call that evergreen record keeping. It needs to deal with change over time. Keeping a record of your processing information is not a one-off exercise. The regulators have been very clear about that, and the law has been clear. In fact, I mentioned earlier, if you're familiar, the data protection impact assessment requirements of the GDPR very explicitly states that changes to processing have to be managed in accordance with the risk management framework and assessed for risk change. We've also got quite a need to collaborate with other business colleagues on classification and on change. So business processes that involve change will involve describing how these might impact our assessments of risk. And we're very often going to need to describe what we're doing to our colleagues. So if you've tried telling your InfoSec team, well, they're in the extended properties, you're going to have a look, then you might find that you get a slightly negative response to that, not to mention from a risk function or compliance function. We think people need to work together with a slightly more visible, more accessible way of describing metadata. And of course, that's the alert to change and the deviation from best practice. So I should describe where Redgate are up to at the moment. We're developing with a small team, a small group of highly engaged customers with a new look on a data catalog. We're implementing changes in a very tight iterative cycle to respond to their needs, to unblock them as the people who are engaged in real world classification exercises. They're doing this day in, day out as part of their work. They need to get to completion, and we want to know what's blocking them. So we're starting out as quite common practice these days with a very small focus group. We've got a larger group that we're keeping informed and keeping up to date, and we're going to gradually expand our group of users so that when we solve the basics, we can start to solve for larger and larger numbers of people. So we're on an active path on that at the moment. Here's some designs that we're working with. We believe in a classification that sits together with some other capabilities. So here you'll see that we're gathering in on the left-hand side. We're looking after an inventory of SQL Server instances. We're applying classifications. We're trying to apply some bulk operation abilities to those. These are the designs that we're building to at the moment. We want overviews that are going to work for non-technical users, but also to show progress, to show how much has been done to date, how much is required to continue, and to be, as much as possible a live view of the data estate. And we think there are capabilities we can bring to this, like advanced search. This is being written right at the moment, just around the corner from me. The engineers are putting the final touches on some advanced search across the estate, which we think is going to be key to really breaking the back of the first initial classification exercise. And then we're going to come on to keeping that information up to date. You may know that Redgate has some schema change IP. We've used it in our DLM dashboard product, for example. So that's kind of a lot of the things that Redgate has as part of our capabilities. We think we can bring to bear on the challenge of creating a data catalog and maintaining it over time, and using that information in applying policy and applying the correct treatment and showing your organization that you're doing so. So I'm going to move on to a demonstration of where we're at with this early software. So we call it our early access program. There is a sign up page. I'll share the link very shortly after this demonstration. And we'd really like people who have a classification need, who want to keep in touch and know what we're doing, to join that program. Tell us what you need to do data classification for. We'll keep you updated on the work, and in increasing numbers, we'll invite you in to work with us on very specific requirements that we want our new version of the data catalog to solve. So with that, I'm going to jump into a further demonstration. So this is the future version of our data privacy suite. You'll see it bears some similarity to those designs that I showed earlier, and there's a few things that where we're a little differentiated already from the approach that Microsoft has taken to date in SQL Server Management Studio. You'll notice first of all that we're tagging instances as having a place in the software development lifecycle. So we think we will want to have visibility. We think information security functions and database professionals will want to have visibility of multiple environments. We're exploring how dynamic environments work in this scenario. For some, development environments are a very transient thing. For others, it's a more permanent situation. But I've just registered a few instances so far with my data catalog. And if I go into one of these instances, I can see that the approach actually is fairly similar to the Microsoft one at the moment. I can see classification suggestions for each schema each database that's sitting on my instance. One change that we've made already, which we're not sure which we're not sure how it will be implemented by Microsoft, if at all, indeed. But we've recognised that requirement to be able to store the classifications in an external repository in some cases. So for those vendor schemas specifically, we recognise that many of the people we're working with want to classify but can't store it in those extended properties. That's not to say that we always want to store in the external repository either. There are really strong advantages to storing in the extended properties and later in the attributes of when that's adopted in the SQL Server engine for the on-premise installations. The properties or the attributes will travel with the database, and so a backed up and restored database will have the same values as it had originally. There's many advantages to having this information accessible in the context that you're in as well. So if you want to query the attributes or extended properties while putting together a query, you can do so, and that's something that certainly seems to be of some interest if we're going to bring governance to the developer rather than making a blocker at the end of the process. But we think from our research so far, we found strong interest in both. In some classifiers have a requirement for the option at the database level. Some have a clear preference. So we're looking at both and dealing with the synchronization issues. And I should mention as well, one of the key aspects of how we're doing this is that we're Microsoft Gold partners. We want to make sure that we're interoperable with the Microsoft approach and continue to be as it changes over time. So if you go halfway through your classification process using the SQL Server Management Studio data classification task, we want to ensure that we can use that information, that you haven't lost work. and vice versa. We want to make sure that switching the approach isn't going to be is going to mean losing a lot of work for you. So we have that option. We're working through those workflows. Of course, I mentioned that we're looking at the ability to perform advanced searches on there. At the moment, we have the classification suggestions paradigm in the same way that Microsoft do. We're looking at how we can make that better, and we're hearing from our engaged customers what we need to do next in order to make this more amenable to their needs. We've got one of the, I mentioned the advanced search. We're also seeing a need to extend the categories that can be applied to enable classification. We found a fairly limited number of organizations where the information type and the sensitivity label were really enough. Most organizations have an additional need, so we're looking at meeting that need, and that's going to be coming out in a version of this software very soon. So we're working on making data classification efficient. That's our core focus at the moment. One of the advantages of having performed a classification, of course, if I go back, is that we can use that information in other contexts. And one of the strengths that Redgate's developed in the last couple of years in addressing data privacy concerns is our SQL provision product. So already we integrate in the SQL provision workflow when we're doing work that is relevant for classification. Just briefly, you may recognize this interface. You're looking at SQL Clone, the dashboard for SQL Clone. It's part of our provisioning product that includes some sophisticated data masking. So if you have a need to take control of that provision of database into non-production environments, I strongly suggest that you look at SQL Clone. I won't go into a full demo of it here, but what we do with SQL Clone is that we create images, we curate images in effect that are then available for developers to use, that can be put into automation workflows for database DevOps work. They can be retrieved as virtualized copies with the masking having been performed and verified by developers, by development teams. And this has been seen some very strong adoption during this period of data breach and regulatory change. So just briefly, I'm looking at my create image workflow. I'm going to create an image of the AdventureWorks database, which I've classified. I'll just move back to, let's have a look at this, the classification. So on my production server, I have already done the work to classify the AdventureWorks database, and I have some classifications there. If I go to make that available as a database copy for developers, I realize I'm moving a little quickly through this. My action at the moment is to prepare a database copy so that developers can use it safely. I want to know that I'm performing the right masking operation, that I'm not exposing personal data beyond what's absolutely necessary to run our production systems. And so as part of my create image workflow, because my system is connected to a Redgate data catalog, it knows that some of this data has been classified as confidential and confidential under the GDPR. So I'm recommended to apply a masking set. One of the areas we're looking at, of course, is do database administrators want to see this enforced? Do they want to see this compulsory? But at the moment, we've got this capability as a recommendation. So if I continue, I'm invited to add a masking set, and we have the ability to drop our masking set files, which are defined using our data masker product. So that's all well and good. It warns me that there's a database that's got some sensitive information in it and that I shouldn't distribute it. If we look at a slightly different example, if we see whether we can create a data image for distribution to dev test from this worldwide importers database, for example, wide world importers, I should say, I ought to see a slightly different result. So again, I'm going to create a new image from a SQL Server database. I'm going to look at the wide world importers, and in this case, I have a slightly different message. I'm now being told that I ought to perform classification. There are suggestions, I ought to act on them. So if I click into this workflow, I get taken to the place where I can do those suggestions. And this is where we see information governance in a data catalog going as being something that's integrated and available to all your other processes. And we're building this with an open API. It's an API first implementation whereby customers can write their own integrations into their workflows so that they know that they're doing the right thing. They have the guarantees that they want. I can apply my suggestions en masse for that database, and I can go back to my create image workflow. If I now perform a create image workflow, I want to get a different message for that database. And I've no data that's been classified as sensitive. I believe that may have been a slight missynchronization there. Let me just check I rejected. No, I do have. I didn't reject all the classifications. So this is an early access version of the software, as I mentioned, but we've already got it integrated with our provisioning software. But right now our focus is on tackling that need to really get over the line. So please do join our data access program. We think that we can deliver a data classification workflow that is going to work for the organizations that have a pressing need just now. We think we'll be able to address some problems in a way that really makes the difference for those engaged in data classification projects. And we want to hear more about what's happening out there, what kind of needs that we need to address, what we need to look at next. So if you do have an interest in using a data catalog, in being part of that first wave of Redgate adopters who are going to meet their compliance needs, meet their data privacy concerns, then please do join our early access program. You can see the URL there, and as I mentioned, we'd really like to see engagement in answering our questions. We'll be inviting the group to Slack channels to keep the conversation going, and increasingly we'll be inviting people to join our early access program and work really closely with us. So we're just about running out of time. There's a couple of interesting questions there, so I'll just address those just before we sign off there. So I've got a question from Theodore there saying, do we have a metadata entry tool that interfaces to Documenter? So for a long time we've had I don't know whether you're aware of our SQL Doc product. There are obvious sort of overlaps and possible synergies with database documentation here. We will be exploring those. At the moment, if you need to provide metadata entry for the descriptions, then SQL Doc is good for that. If you're looking for an interface between that metadata entry and documentation, if you've ever run SQL Doc on a SQL Server database that has the extended properties implementation, you will see that information there, but there's certainly more things that we can do in surfacing that in a more accessible way. So that is something that we're looking at. Integration with other products, SQL Compare is an obvious one. The SQL Compare works with extended properties, as you might expect. It treats them as any other. The description, the information type and sensitivity labels are treated in the same way as other extended properties. So you will be able to synchronize them using SQL Compare. But again, there is more to be done. And we're also looking to an interesting question there from Mohammed. The differentiation against master data management products, some of those older incumbent products. We think this is going to be the data catalog that's awesome for SQL Server DBAs, and who, especially for those who are working with to address the data privacy needs, rather more specifically to address the protection needs of the SQL Server estate, more than some of the enterprise descriptive and data democratization needs that some of the larger enterprise tools have been addressed at previously. We think we've got a great database DevOps story. We've got some schema change IP that we want to bring to bear, and we think that there's scope in the data catalog market for something that really optimizes on breaking the back of this problem for those new to information governance, especially for those who just really need to address these new and emerging challenges. So that's it for now. Thanks very much for your time this afternoon. One thing before we go, so please do join if you're interested in learning more about our data catalog work. Please join the early access program. There's a web form there and some descriptions of what we're doing. And don't forget, there's next Tuesday, there's a webinar from Redgate being presented by Jean Kim, author, of course, of the Phoenix Project and among many other seminal books on understanding how we can best work in the DevOps world. And he's discussing and presenting some findings from the 2018 State of DevOps report. So that should be really something to look forward to, and please put that in your calendar and go to the Redgate Hub on the Redgate website to sign up for that. So thanks very much for your time again today, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.